that the Amazons don't age, and he further expands on that point.
Now, of course, there are no old women on this island, because that would beg the question, where are all these women coming from? Is there a gimp in a leather suit, in a box used for sperm harvesting, a male baby's killed off?
So where are the old Amazons, and without men, how are the Amazons being born? Well, near the start of the movie, Diana's mother, the Queen of the Amazons, explains all this to Diana as a child. The Amazons were created by Zeus, and we see them emerging from the sea as fully grown women. And Diana's mother in this flashback appears to be the exact same age as she is when she's reading the story. So the Amazons aren't born, they were created by a god, and they don't appear to age, which explains both why there aren't any old Amazons and why they don't need any men on the island. And if the literal picture book explained to a child method of exposition was a bit too complicated for Stefan, there are other clues cleverly hidden in the narrative. For example, Diana ages from a child to a fully grown woman without any other character on the island aging a day. Isn't that odd? Now, Diana ages, I presume, because she's not an Amazon exactly. She was created differently from the rest of them as a child. But even she ages very slowly. And the big tip-off here is that the movie opens in the present day, but the bulk of it is a flashback set in the First World War, and Wonder Woman looks exactly the same in both times. Didn't Stefan wonder why this was? Did he not notice that that was unusual? I don't know.
And these Amazons take the only man on the island and interrogate him. When logically, of course, they should be burying him in affirmative action programs.
Now this is a minor point here, but the Amazons interrogate him because he's dressed in the same uniform as the soldiers who attacked them, because he's a spy.
No, mother, no! He fought at my side against the
Good man fights against his own people.
These are my people.
And why do you wear their colors?
I can't tell you that.
So they interrogate him to find out why that is. You know, they're not just doing it arbitrarily, but like I say, that's a minor point.
Cliché number 2. Women are great warriors. Now, I've criticized female fighters in movies before for taking on men 3 times their size with little or no prior training. In this movie, Wonder Woman, whose actual name is Diana, does go through years of rigorous training, but gains supernatural powers somehow when she hits her late teens. She magically throws back her trainer half the length of the football field by blocking a sword blow with her golden bracers. This new power has 2 primary meanings. The first is the pushback of an abused child who has grown bigger and stronger than her aging abuser. The second is the displacement of an older woman's physical attractiveness by a younger woman.
So there's a lot to unpack here. First off, Wonder Woman's size doesn't matter. She's a demigod with supernatural powers. She can hold a tank over her head. You know, the amount of training she does is, with regards to fighting against human men, anyway, completely inconsequential. She's training to fight against Ares, the god of war. She could crush a human man's head like a grape even if she hadn't trained a day in her life, because she's not human. Secondly, Stefan's 2 primary readings of the meaning of this scene are very telling. The pushback of an abused child and the displacement of an older woman's physical attractiveness by a younger woman. Now, okay, I'm generally rather accepting of unconventional takes on movies. I mean, I have to be. I'm pals with the prequel Defender himself. But I can't help but think Stefan is reaching a little too far here. Diana and her aunt appear to have a good relationship, so I'm not sure the abuser angle flies, really. To me, this scene is just showing that Diana has some unexplained power that differentiates her from the rest of the Amazons. That seems to be the primary meaning of the scene, and as we'll see later in the video, it's a meaning that Stefan missed somehow, but we'll get back to that later.
Cliché number 3. The hot Amazon supermodel librarian. A beautiful woman who has no idea how attractive she is. The dream of beta males everywhere who've never listened to Stanley Kowalski from A Streetcar Named Desire, who says this to an erotic woman fishing for compliments. I never met a dame yet that didn't know if she was good looking or not without being told. And there's some of them that give themselves credit for more than they've got. Trust me, the lead actress may be playing a naive, otherworldly warrior, but in real life, she knows exactly how attractive she is. She was a model who married a man who sold a hotel for $26 million. Here's a hint. You're not going to take off her thick glasses, tell her she's beautiful, and have her fall in love with you.
So for cliche number 3, I have 3 points to make. Isn't that nice? The first is that Diana isn't human and has never interacted with human society, and therefore doesn't have the same ideas about what is appropriate behaviour or is attractive to the opposite sex. She's never even met a man before the events of the movie.
Have you never met a man before? Well, what about your father?
I had no father.
Secondly, it doesn't matter who the actor is. She's playing a character. We know she's rich and famous in real life, but that isn't supposed to affect the narrative of the film. You know, does Stefan do this for other movies? Henry Cavill can't fly. He's just a regular human actor. This film doesn't make any sense. Thirdly, the idea that Diana is still very attractive, even if you cover her up and put glasses on her, is actually stated outright in the film.
Yeah, really specs. Suddenly she's not the most beautiful woman you've ever seen.
The film's point here, one that it makes a few too many times for me to be honest, is that yes, Diana is very attractive. Anyway.
Cliché number 4, the incomprehensibly jealous and angry villain. Now, the intergalactic badass in Wonder Woman is the god Ares, who becomes jealous of Zeus's favorite created toy, humanity. So this is basic sibling rivalry cliché 101. The elder sibling resents the younger sibling for the attention paid by the parents to the new arrival, who has displaced him.
I have 2 points to make here, and the first one is kind of a minor nitpicky one. Ares isn't an intergalactic villain. He doesn't travel to or from another galaxy at any point. And now I only bring this up because Stefan has previously misunderstood the word intergalactic. Now I think he thinks it means like phenomenal or grand or something. Anyway. Secondly here, Stefan says Ares, the god of war, being angry is a cliche. And if Stefan has a problem with the conflict between Zeus and Ares, or Ares being violent and angry, or even the Amazonian warrior women, he really needs to take that up with the ancient Greeks. You know, this narrative isn't the result of some modern malicious Hollywood machination. They're characters from Greek mythology. And I thought Stefan was all about the ancient Greeks and Western civilization and everything. But I guess I must have been mistaken there.
Diana, princess of blow-dried hair, shopping and not eating. Sorry. Wrong Princess Diana. Diana, princess of Themyscira, possesses powers that make no sense at all. So, Ares, the god of war, kills her father Zeus. Now, Ares has been provoking fights among mankind for thousands of years. But Diana was molded of clay, and Zeus was supposed to have breathed life into her a few short years before the movie began. Diana is an Amazon with superpowers. But the Amazons are mere mortals felled by a single bullet.
So first off, there was a conflict between Zeus and Ares, during which Ares was injured and went into hiding. Now Zeus was also injured and used the last of his strength to create the island paradise for the Amazons to live on. Now then, given that Diana ages incredibly slowly, as shown by her appearing the same age over a period of 100 years from the First World War to the modern day, Diana's childhood could have lasted hundreds or even thousands of years. Who knows? You know, Stefan saw a child age into a woman and thought, oh, that probably took about 25 years. But no, she's a demigod living on a supernatural island. She doesn't age like regular humans. Secondly, Diana isn't an Amazon, and that's what the scene of her discovering her unique powers was supposed to represent. But if you missed that, Stefan, there also was this line of dialogue.
As Amazons, this is our duty.
But you are not an Amazon like the rest of us. So you will do nothing.
And movies must be very confusing indeed if you just ignore half of what happens in them. Anyway, let's move on.
Now, Chris Pine. Chris Pine is in fact a charming pile of J.Crew waspy hotness and helps carry the movie with his one-liners that shouldn't be one-liners. Now, as the audience, you become attached to him, and then, of course, he has to die, so that the population of the world always gets used to male disposability. And even the way he dies makes no sense. He's piloting a plane full of poison gas, which he chooses to blow up rather than, say, land safely. Because why? Landing the plane safely would allow the poison gas to be deactivated. Blowing it up in midair will just spread the poison gas for hundreds of miles, causing countless deaths, the prevention of which was the whole point and MacGuffin of the movie to begin with. But you see, men must always be expendable, so plot and logic must be expendable as well.
So then, Chris Pine's sacrifice in order to blow up the poison gas plane. Stefan doesn't understand why the plane can't just be landed safely, but the movie does attempt to explain this.
If we can get her on the radio, we can ask Flying Court to shoot her down. No, if it crashes, it'll wipe everyone out for 50 square miles. We gotta ground it.
Bad news! It's on a timer. If we ground it here, it's the same thing.
Stefan also doesn't understand why they have to blow the plane up, but the movie explains this as well.
Is it flammable, Chief?
Yes, you said it's hydrogen? It's flammable.
So the gas is going to be released on a timer and will disperse over a large area, killing everyone around. But it is flammable, so if they explode the plane, the gas will burn up. So Chris Pine flies the plane to a safe distance and then does just that. Is it convoluted movie logic? A little bit, sure, but it does explain itself, and it shouldn't be hard to follow. And furthermore, the selfless sacrifice of a man also serves an important narrative purpose that is missed by Stefan, and let's take a look at that.
And if you think I'm kidding about male disposability, think of this. Remember the evil woman, Dr. Poison, who concocts the genocidal gas? Remember how Wonder Woman spares her life? She gets to live, the good guy doesn't.
So then, Diana spares the life of the evil Dr. Poison, and this proves male disposability, apparently. But I feel like Stefan may have missed the point of this scene, if you couldn't believe such a thing. You see, Ares is using her to say to Diana, look, humans are rubbish, they're evil, they make weapons to kill each other with. Let's team up and we'll go and get them. And in response to this, Diana remembers Chris Pine and how nice he was, blowing himself up to save everyone. And she says, no, actually, mankind can be good. I believe in them, and I'm not going to join you. You see, the woman's actions are being used as the proof that mankind is evil, and the man's noble sacrifice is being used as the counter-argument that mankind is good. And, of course, Diana spares the life of an unarmed opponent. I mean, what's she gonna do? Just squish her with the tank or something? You know, she's the hero at the climax of the movie. I mean, what were you expecting to happen? Actually, I'd kind of like that if Diana just dropped the tank on her completely unexpectedly. That'd be quite good.
Now, as usual, almost all the on-screen deaths are male. Female deaths are inevitably deployed as a plot device to heighten the stakes, to raise the tension. Men die anonymously in quick succession, women die slowly or off-screen. Using sympathy for women to provoke male aggression does not seem very feminist to me. Well, maybe it is. Hard to tell these days.
Now, I'm afraid this is one of those times that Stefan is correct only if we ignore the times where he's wrong. For example, the battle at the start of the movie in which many Amazons are killed by German soldiers in quick succession. But if we ignore this bit, though, Stefan makes an excellent point.
So, all men are evil or incompetent, except for non-white males, of course, with the exception of one, the Chris Pine character, who must die. Now, all women are wonderful and good, except for one, Dr. Poison, who gets to live.
Now, these few sentences are a real masterpiece of appearing to have an argument when in fact you don't really. And let's think about this for a bit. All men are presented as evil or incompetent, except for non-white males, of course, with the exception of one, Chris Pine, who has to die. So, built into Stefan's all men statement, there are two exceptions. All men are presented as evil, only if we first discount the various presentations of men as not evil. And if we do that, wow, point made, you know. However, even with Stefan's caveats there, it's not true. For example, all these white soldiers rushing across no man's land are presented pretty heroically, and these liberated villagers seem like they're having a good time, and they don't look evil or incompetent. And there's also Charlie, who's generally a good guy, but I guess he falls under Stefan's classification of incompetent because he doesn't want to fight anymore due to having PTSD, which, you know, would be a bit cruel and thoughtless. But anyway, ultimately, the fairly uncomplicated message of the movie is that mankind can be good. Stefan misses this because he's viewing the movie only along the racial and sexual lines that he's imposing. You know, it's not enough that the principal male character is a heroic white man. You know, not all the male characters are heroic white men, and as such, the movie is clearly anti-male, anti-white propaganda.
And what is the role of women in raising such nasty and violent men? Completely absent from the film, of course. Men are just bad. The women who raised them are just saints. For feminists and leftists, environment is everything. You know, you are a criminal because you were raised poor in a poor neighborhood, except for men. Well, they're just bad regardless of environment, regardless of the mothers and female daycare workers and female primary school teachers who raised them, regardless of the welfare state policies that women vote for. Environment creates badness, except for boys raised by women. Then the badness of boys has absolutely nothing to do with women at all.
Well, again, the point of the movie is actually not that men are naturally just bad. But regardless, does Stefan really want the movie to go into how the evil General Ludendorff, say, actually would have been a really nice guy but for the malicious actions of his abusive mother, who raised him poorly? Like, what on earth is that? You know, we all remember this classic clip of Stefan I used in another video.
All the cold-hearted jerks who run the world came out of the vaginas of women who married assholes. And I don't know how to make the world a better place without holding women accountable for choosing assholes.
All the evil men in the world came out of evil women's evil vaginas. Now, it appears Stefan has convinced himself pretty well of this convoluted delusion, because it seems he's now actually expecting to see it represented in reality. And it's an interesting approach to art criticism, I guess. Convince yourself of something truly mad, and then when you don't see any evidence of it, that proves the existence of the insidious conspiracy to cover it up. So to any Stefan Molyneux fans watching this video, the reason that the movie doesn't go into the backstories of the violent German soldiers and explore their abuse at the hands of their neglectful mothers who only went out with arseholes and ignored all the nice guys is because it would be really, really weird. Anyway, that's about it from me today. Kind of a lighter one this time, but the other video I'm working on right now is about police shootings, so I needed the levity, to be honest. And I certainly had fun watching Stefan try to cram his ideology into the movie however he could. I might come back to this again and check out the many, many other movies that Stefan tells us the truth about. I hope you could hear the air quotes there. Let me know what you think about that idea in the comments. Also consider supporting me on Patreon, if you like all these lovely people right here. I don't run ads on my videos, and I'd like to keep it that way. Also, follow me on Twitter or send me a Curious Cat question if you like. I really like questions. Okay, folks, I'll see you next time. I actually waved goodbye at my microphone. See ya. Hello, everyone. Before we get to our main topic today, I want to talk very briefly about marathon running. So way back in 1985, science journal Nature published an article predicting that by the year 2000, women would be consistently running faster marathon times than men. Now, what led them to make this prediction? Well, it was the data they had. They saw that men's marathon times had hit a plateau, and the record time was increasing only very slowly and by very small amounts. The women's record time, on the other hand, was increasing much faster. So by extrapolating out the very slow growth of the men's record time and the relatively fast growth of the women's record time, they predicted that women would catch up to and pass men within a decade or two. Now then, they made a mistake, didn't they? One which got them not a small amount of impolite mocking. And what was that? Well, by just extrapolating the current data trends into the future, you'd fairly quickly have women running the marathon faster than the speed of sound, which is probably highly unlikely. Where nature went wrong was not considering any other factors which might have an effect on those data trends in the future. For example, women hitting the same plateau as the men did, which is, of course, what happened. Women's times had been increasing quickly because not as many women were participating as men. Women's sports science wasn't as advanced as men's, but as women caught up to the men's times, those trends changed, obviously. So why am I talking about this blunder by a science journal in 1985? Well, I just want to highlight the danger of projecting current short-term data trends decades into the future. For example, will birth rates among poorer immigrant populations remain the same several generations down the line? It's something to think about and keep in mind. So then, what's the actual topic of my video today? Well, it's a recent video uploaded by Lauren Southern called The Great Replacement, and let's watch the introduction to that.
Hey everyone, okay, so today we are going to be talking about a very serious subject, something that I think a lot of people are too afraid to talk about because they're worried about being called a bigot by both the people on the left and the right, surprisingly. So in order to avoid people trying to discredit this video with name-calling of Nazi or propagandists or other such nonsense, it's going to be a very data-based video for the first bit.
Yay, data analysis, that's me. I have a little alarm that goes off when someone says data on YouTube. So that intro there had a few of the regular white nationalist rhetorical tricks you see online. Lots of people agree with us. They're all just too afraid to talk about it. You see, they don't want to be called racist. They're scared, but we're going to talk about it because we're brave, aren't we? Us talking about it, yeah. Silly. Lauren also tries to avoid accusations of racist and Nazi by saying, this is a data-based video. I'm going to be talking about statistics. Statistics can't be racist, they're just a bunch of numbers. So by the rhetorical framework I just imposed here, I literally can't be a racist. Well, we'll see about that. So anyway, what is the topic of Lauren's video?
So bear with me, because the thing I want to talk about today is the Great Replacement. The Great Replacement is a term coined by French writer Renaud Camus, referring to what he views as the irreversible overthrow of France and its culture by Muslim immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa. The Great Replacement is a very simple concept. You have one people, and in the space of a single generation, you have a different people. Despite various misrepresentations, Camus does not oppose current immigration policy out of racism or Islamophobia, but on the basis of the preservation of French traditions and culture. And though Camus has had his eyes set specifically on France, his concerns have been shared by many nationalist and identitarian movements all across Europe. But the real question that comes in now is there any evidence that a Great Replacement is actually occurring? Or is Camus just another instance of paranoid white panic? Is he just another racist xenophobe who deserves to be convicted of a hate crime in order to pay a €4,000 fine? Yeah, that actually happens in Europe.
I'll stop you there, Lauren, first off. This says, in connection with 2 separate bar clashes in Paris with people who accused him of hate crimes, and then he didn't even appear in court for the verdict. And apparently he was shouting, I love Hitler, people like you would be dead, your mothers, your forefathers would all be fucking gassed at people. So, good. Fuck that guy. Anyway, let's talk about the Great Replacement, which means white genocide. By the way, it's the exact same concept. It's just been given a makeover to try and sell it to more people. White genocide is a conspiracy theory that says white people are dying out due to a combination of race mixing and white people having children at a slower rate than non-white people. as if it's a competition. Now, not only is this not true, there are more white people alive today than at any point in history, it's also not genocide. Even if it was happening, it's not deliberate. It'd just be a demographic change over time. That's not genocide. No white people are getting killed because of this. That's white privilege for you, I guess. We even get the nice version of genocide. Of course, the sorts of people who believe this rubbish will tell you it is deliberate because it's supposedly the Jews doing it, which, they think because they're racist morons. But people like Lauren Southern and Stefan Molyneux and others who peddle this replacement rubbish, well, they aren't allowed to say it's the Jews doing it because then they'd lose their platforms for being openly racist. So, because they can't openly blame it on the Jews, I can say it's not deliberate and therefore not genocide, and they're not allowed to retort, which is awfully fun. It's a bit like cheating, they know they're being anti-Semitic, and I know they're being anti-Semitic, but only I get to say it. Anyway, so replacement is the PC term these people have come up with to stand in for white genocide, and it's a silly term, and I'll give you an example. Here's a picture of a giraffe, say, and now I'm going to replace that picture of a giraffe with a picture of a dog. Do you see what happened there? I replaced one thing with another thing. That's what replacement means. Now let's try it another way. Here's the picture of the giraffe, and now here's the dog. And would you look at that? We've got both. They're both still there. Nothing's been replaced, They both just are there now. Do you follow? Anyway, let's get into Lauren's data.
But despite all of these roadblocks, the stats that we do have access to paint a pretty clear picture. In 1993, 7% of the UK population was foreign-born, and 3.6% were foreign nationals. With the 2004 European Union enlargement and drastic shifts in immigration policy, those numbers rose to 13.5% and 8.9% in 2015. These populations are primarily of Indian, Pakistani, or African background.
Uh-oh, that was a lie. Sorry, Lauren. So the stats that were just showed there come from the Migration Observatory from the University of Oxford. And Lauren cites two sources from the Migration Observatory. Let's take a look at those. The first is long-term international migration flows to and from the UK. And for a start, this one says, the share of EU citizens in LTIM inflows and net flows has increased. The share of EU citizens among incoming migrants has been steadily increasing since 2004, when it stood at 22%, and is much higher than the average for the 2000 to 2003 period, when it stood at about 13%. By contrast, the share of immigrants from outside the EU has declined from 63% of all incoming migrants in 2004 to 45% in 2016. So according to this study, migrants from outside the EU account for less than half of the total incoming migrants. Now, I know you're Canadian, Lauren, maybe you don't know that much about Europe, so a little geography lesson for you. India, Pakistan, and Africa aren't in Europe. It's not even close. And if we take a look at the other Migration Observatory source, Migrants in the UK, an overview, that one actually lists the countries that migrants into the UK come from. And the number one spot is Poland. Poland tops the tables for both country of birth and country of citizenship among migrants in the UK. And take a look at these countries. The vast majority of countries on this list are within Europe. These are mainly European migrants coming into the UK. These populations are primarily of Indian, Pakistani, or African background is just a flat-out lie. Why is Lauren ignoring the Polish immigrants, for instance? I wonder why that could possibly be. Well, it's because they're white, obviously. You see, this thumbnail with all the little black figures outnumbering the little white figures, that wouldn't make any sense if she was like, oh yeah, by the way, most of these immigrants are just Europeans moving around the EU, and those Europeans are generally white themselves. It's harder to scaremonger for a racist audience if you actually tell the truth. But let's carry on and take a look at this headline. Migrants change UK forever, white Britons will be minority by 2066. Let's talk about this. So first off, this headline doesn't mean that white people will be a minority in the UK. It means that self-identified white Britons will be not necessarily a minority, but not the overall statistical majority. And what's the difference there? Well, if 49% of the country identify as white British, they'll still be the largest group unless every single other person in the country identifies as the same thing. In actuality, what you would have would be 49% white British, and then a certain percentage for Asian British, a certain percentage for black British, a certain percentage for white Irish. You know, from the news report, in the study, minorities are classed as people who also describe themselves in censuses as Irish or another nationality. So a certain percentage for white Polish people, I guess, if we're acknowledging that they exist and aren't actually from Pakistan. Anyway, the largest group would still be white British. I mean, they're not going anywhere. They'll still exist. It's just that cumulatively, all the people who self-identify as something other than that, added together, would be the slight majority in 50 years' time. And it doesn't sound so scary when you put it like that, does it? And this is all assuming that the current data trends can be projected 50 years into the future while staying the same. And it might be worthwhile looking at who compiled this data. From the Express, it was Professor David Coleman. Now, who is Professor David Coleman? Well, he is the founder of Migration Watch UK. Hello, Migration Watch UK. It's nice to see you again so soon. And he's also a member of the Galton Institute, formerly known as the Eugenics Society. And there's no prizes for guessing why they had to change the name. It's actually quite funny how little effort you have to put in to get past Lauren's gossamer thin, politically correct veil and see all the weird Nazi shit behind her positions. The first source on her list in her video description is The Great Replacement Part 2, Great Britain, from Defend Europa, written by a chap called William, who handily links his Twitter account @RealWilliam. And let's see some of the things he has to say. I'm still waiting. Nobody can present me with conclusive evidence that gas chambers even existed, let alone that 6 million were gassed. Am I a racist? If racist means against other races who wish to harm my race, then yes, guilty as charged. Capitalism and Bolshevism are two sides of the same international Jewish coin. Adolf Hitler. So, good first source there, Lauren, a self-identified, Hitler-quoting, anti-Semitic, Holocaust-denying racist. I'm sure he's got an unbiased opinion about immigrants. You know, I can't be racist, I'm just quoting statistics. Oh, by the way, my first source is a fucking Nazi. And let's have a look at some of the top comments on Lauren's video, which I screen capped before they started getting deleted. 1488. That's a good start there, very subtle. Here's some truth. Jews were and are to blame for the Great Replacement. And then a bunch of other crap. The Great Replacement is a Jew-orchestrated plan of white genocide. This is happening because of Jews. The Jews hate us. Zionist Jew degeneracy. Etc. And it goes on. Quite the elephant in the room we have here. This is the problem that people like Lauren are going to run into again and again. Their viewer base is just too clueless to play ball. And it's difficult to sanitize white nationalism when you have a bunch of dudes in white hoods behind you ranting about the Jewish question. You know, we're all onto this game by now, Lauren. You're not fooling anyone. Anyway, let's carry on and have a bit of a think about Germany. So Lauren has a few sources about Germany in her video description there. This from Information Liberation. Nearly 40% of Germany's under 5s are foreigners. Now, that's not true. If they were born in Germany, they're German citizens. They're not foreigners. What you mean to say, and what you're actually outraged about, is that those people might not be white. I also like this picture here, which has a bunch of smiling children waving the German flag, and this is supposed to be a bad thing somehow. There's also this story from the Daily Mail. Germans now the minority in Frankfurt. More than half of residents in the city have a migrant background. And the top comment on this article is pretty funny. Migrant background? That could still mean they were born and raised in Germany, speak German as their first language, and are German citizens with no other allegiance. Very misleading headline. That comment is from Tommy there, not Robinson, I assume. As a side note here, this article manages to spell the word integrate 3 different ways in just 2 sentences, which is impressive, to say the least. Anyway, yes, Tommy's right. People of a migrant background doesn't mean migrants. It means people of a migrant background, which, depending on where you want to mark the cutoff point in history, that could include any number of people. Also, again, not that it matters, but like in the UK, the majority of these migrants are from other European countries. Quoting the article, Turkish migrants are the largest non-German minority that are settled in Frankfurt, accounting for 13% of the population. A further 61% of residents who were born abroad have come from other countries within the European Union. Lauren, again, doesn't mention this because she's trying to mislead her audience about the race of the migrants. You know, if the majority of them are other Europeans, it ruins the white nationalist narrative. There's another point here about the duration these migrants plan to stay, because of course, not all migrants are permanent migrants. And looking again at Lauren's Migration Observatory source, the share of immigrants planning to stay for shorter periods of 1 to 2 years has increased since the 1990s, with less than a third of incoming migrants planning to stay for a period of more than 4 years. Lauren doesn't mention this and treats all migrants as though they are permanent migrants, when the statistics just don't support this. Anyway, let's move on and take a look at Lauren's main source, which is this chap, Renaud Camus. Saying that wrong. And let's have a little read of a WordPress blog post written about Camus and his replacement theory, that I found in Lauren's sources, by the way. Firstly, there is no racial replacement in Europe as the immigrants are not numerous enough to change the colour of the locals. Secondly, if there is a cultural drift, is that drift due to immigration or perhaps to globalisation, i.e. fashions and behaviours from around the world coming to our doorstep via the internet? His views lead him to make two astonishing statements. Firstly, he takes Israel as a positive example that Europe should be well advised to imitate by remigrating foreigners back to their country of origin. This is funny when one knows that Mr. Camus' supporters are in fact anti-Zionists, as anti-Semitism is now called among the thinking elite. Secondly, he argues that Europeans should contribute significantly more to the economic support and development in the Third World, and in particular Africa, basically paying them to stay home, rather than having them come and eat our food. No one of a serious mind would give support to Renaud Camus for these odd views. Well, and again, I didn't go looking for that source. This is listed in the description of Lauren's video. You can go and check. So anyway, I have a pro video making tip for you, Lauren. Maybe don't include links to articles that imply your main source is an irrational idiot. I mean, what happened there? Were there not enough positive articles about the guy, so you had to include ones that dunk on him for being a moron? I don't know. So anyway, that WordPress blog was right. Camus' plan to deal with the migrants is to re-migrate them, i.e. ship them all back home. In an article on Free West Media, Camus says, the means and ends are one and the same. Re-migration, the return of the conquering peoples to their own lands. Conquering peoples. So, okay, very sorry to everyone in the US and Canada, but you're going to have to move back to Europe, which is a bit concerning, to be perfectly honest. I don't know where we're going to put you all. Of course, Camus probably doesn't mean this. The arbitrary line he's drawn in history for when we need to stop migration and ship everyone back is probably not going to have to include any white people being shipped anywhere. It's funny how that works, isn't it? Also, Camus' plan wouldn't work. Quite aside from the fact that it is literally impossible to just ship every descendant of a migrant back to where they came from, his measures don't go far enough to stop what he wants to stop. Let's consider the world as a whole. You know, there's no migration to the world, is there? That we know about, anyway. And now let's imagine that all birth rates were equal across every group and type of person. So exactly equal birth rates for everyone. And let's say that they're exactly at replacement levels everywhere, so every country and race has a completely stable population. Now then, what you would still see is the white population declining as a percentage of the whole over time. And why is that? Well, it's because of how we classify whiteness. Barack Obama, for instance, is seen as a black man, despite having one black and one white parent. Do you see my point here, any racist folk who are watching? Immigration and birth rates don't matter. Because of how we classify races, to maintain the white population as the same percentage of the whole, you would have to either ban interracial relationships or introduce measures to reduce the birth rates of non-white people. That is the only logical endpoint of what you're proposing. And I imagine someone might say, wait, But I'm not talking about race, I'm talking about culture and heritage. Yeah, rubbish. But admittedly, there is one aspect to this that isn't racial. There is also a religious element to consider.
Trends in Europe tell the same overall story. As the native European population dies out, migrant and Muslim populations are rapidly growing with higher birth rates and unfettered mass immigration. And with the median age of 32 for Muslims in Europe, 8 years younger than for all Europeans, 5 years younger for the religiously unaffiliated, and 10 years younger for the European Christians, the future of Europe looks pretty halal.
Now, sorry, Lauren, again, that's not true. For a start, Camus states the Great Replacement is very simple. You have one people, and in the space of a generation, you have a different people. The space of one generation. So, how fast is the Muslim population in Europe actually growing? Well, according to another link in Lauren's description, by 2050, the population of Europe that is Muslim will be 10%. 10%. So, in 2050, I will be, for example, 62 years old. So when exactly am I supposed to be replaced? You know, you're telling me that if we don't act now, then in 33 years, assuming current data trends hold, remember, we'll still outnumber Muslims 9-1. You know, excuse me if I don't throw myself out the window in panic here, Lauren. The future of Europe looks pretty halal actually means that in several decades, they will just about be 10% of the population. And I can extrapolate data trends into the future too, as it turns out. The Muslim population of Europe as a percentage of the whole has been increasing by about 1% per decade. So for a clear majority, after they hit 10% in 2050, we'll just have to wait for around 40 decades, which is 400 years. So act now, people of Europe, or in the year 2500, we're really going to be in trouble. We'll have hover mosques or something. Muslims flying around in little Jetsons cars. Anyway.
So let's talk about how this happened. One of the biggest things that we can attribute to the cause of the Great Replacement is Western ethno-masochism. Basically, white people hate themselves. And if you look at groups like Antifa or even just your average college student or state broadcasters, many white people feel that replacing themselves will relieve guilt of past crimes. So unlike almost every other culture in the world that wants to preserve itself and remain homogenous, Europeans actively invite the destruction of their tradition.
So Lauren says this is happening because white people hate themselves and actively want their countries to be destroyed. And it's a clever framing of the argument there. You know, this bad thing is definitely happening, and everyone agrees it is, but some people just want it to happen, you know. Well, speaking as a white man here, Lauren, I don't hate white people. And I don't want my country to be destroyed. But I still disagree with you because I think you're wrong. You've tied culture and national identity to race. And that's bullshit. You don't have to be white to be a British person, or an American person, or a German person, and so on. Insisting that the racial makeups of these countries is something to be concerned about is just incorrect conspiracy theory, racist nonsense. Consider this. In the last century, which of the following actually nearly destroyed Europe? Was it immigrants and people who aren't white? Or was it what Lauren would call a national identitarian movement concerned about minorities changing the culture of their country? Answers on a postcard, thanks. And I'd like to address something else. Lauren thinks that immigration and cultural change represent the death of tradition. I disagree. I think it is our tradition. It's one of the traditions that's worth preserving. When I think about great things my country has done, the first thing that comes to mind is oppose the Nazis. And we didn't do that alone. Like the RAF, for instance, fighting the Battle of Britain, had refugee pilots from all over Europe fighting in it. And we also have a history of taking in migrants, sometimes huge amounts of migrants. Let me talk about my own city for a little bit. While the Irish potato famine was going on, about 1 million Irish people emigrated out of Ireland in a relatively very short period of time. And Liverpool, being a port city close to Ireland, is where a lot of those people ended up. By 1851, about a quarter of Liverpool's population was Irish-born, and that's born in Ireland, not descended from Irish people or whatever. And I'm sure if we had YouTube back then, we'd have people proclaiming the doom of the country. You know, all these Irish people will breed like rabbits. They're all poor. They're a drain on the state. They don't have jobs. They're going to outbreed us and take over, which, you know, it didn't happen, did it? And now, someone might say, well, Irish people aren't like today's immigrants. They were able to integrate. They integrated just fine. No troubles there. Troubles. Do you get it? You know, it's not like there'd ever be any Irish terrorists, would there? It's not like Irish terrorists would set off the most powerful bomb detonated in Great Britain since World War II, is it? It's not like any Irish people would ever launch a mortar attack on Downing Street in order to assassinate the Prime Minister, is it? That's all true, by the way. And now, a few decades later, nobody really cares, you know? Nobody is fretting about Irish birth rates. No one's crossing the road or getting off a bus when they hear an Irish accent, are they? Not many people in Britain are all that fussed anymore. And I wonder why that is. Not really. Again, it's because they're white. But what's my point here, really? Well, Lauren, with regards to the whole white genocide thing, just don't worry about it, you know. Demographic change is inevitable. It will happen regardless of what you do. It's not a matter of fighting it or not. It can't be fought. It's just what happens. It's what's always happened, and it's nothing to worry about. And it won't be as bad as you think, anyway. By the way, it won't be bad at all, of course, in any regard, but I'm trying to speak her language here. You see, birth rates are falling everywhere. With medical advancements, less people needed for farming, you know, more people living in cities, a greater chance of kids living to see adulthood and so on. Fewer children are being born, but this is happening globally. I've mentioned this in another video, but birth rates in predominantly Muslim countries are also falling. Recent migrant populations might have more kids than the average in the country they've moved to, but that's a mix of being generally poorer than the native population, which resolves itself within a few generations, and cultural norms, which also even out after a couple of generations, by and large. You know, anyone looking into the future and trying to predict what different birth rates will be like in 2070 or something, well, it's a fool's errand. We don't know. And I'd like to leave you all with a brief thought about the white fear of becoming a minority. And I'll say this to any fellow worried white people. You are already a minority. You're a minority in lots of ways, many of which might seem trivial to you right now. But what happens when a Nazi-like party comes to power and starts again judging people by nose length, or eye colour, or skull shape? You know, don't start hating on minorities in order to prevent becoming one, because you already are. So just get used to it, I guess, and chill out. Thanks for watching, everyone. This Rome video is never going to come out, is it? Sorry, my fault. I keep getting distracted. I should just completely log off the internet until it's done now. Thanks as always to my supporters over on Patreon, who almost literally put food in my mouth. I love them all, and I hope they all get exactly what they want for their birthdays. And if you would like to be similarly complimented, consider supporting me yourself. It's positively exciting. Also follow me on Twitter if you feel like. Righty-ho folks, I'll see you soon. Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the bell curve. The Bell Curve is a 1994 book by psychologist Richard J. Herrnstein and political scientist Charles Murray, and by way of an introduction here, I'll read the description of the book that's on the back of my copy. Breaking new ground and old taboos, Richard J. Herrnstein and Charles Murray tell the story of a society in transformation. At the top, a cognitive elite is forming in which the passkey to the best schools and the best jobs is no longer social background, but high intelligence. At the bottom, the common denominator of the underclass is increasingly low intelligence rather than racial or social disadvantage. The bell curve describes the state of scientific knowledge about questions that have been on people's minds for years but have been considered too sensitive to talk about openly. Among them, IQ's relationship to crime, unemployment, welfare, child neglect, poverty and illegitimacy, ethnic differences in intelligence, trends in fertility among women with different levels of intelligence, and what policy can do and cannot do to compensate for differences in intelligence. Brilliantly argued and meticulously documented, the bell curve is the essential first step in coming to grips with the nation's social problems. Even though it is now 25 years old, the bell curve's ideas have had quite the lasting impact. Richard Herrnstein passed away shortly before the bell curve was released, but the other author, Charles Murray, has in recent years, among other things, been on an episode of Making Sense with Sam Harris. He's been interviewed on Stefan Molyneux's YouTube channel, had his ideas discussed on the Joe Rogan podcast, and regular viewers of my channel will remember the bell curve being cited in a recent Steven Crowder video. At the time of the book's release, the backlash against it in certain sections of the media and scientific community was furious. Dozens of articles were written by scientists and journalists attacking the book, studies were conducted to debunk its claims, whole books were written to debunk its claims, actually, and these criticisms were often phrased very harshly. Columnist Bob Herbert, writing for the New York Times, described the book as a scabrous piece of racial pornography masquerading as serious scholarship. Mr. Murray can protest all he wants, wrote Herbert. His book is just a genteel way of calling someone the N-word. This controversy ignited by the bell curve has also had quite the lasting impact. When Charles Murray is invited to speak at college campuses, for instance, people turn out in protest, often with angry cries of racist, eugenicist, and so on. And from the enraged reaction to the bell curve, a new reader might expect the book to be blatant and unapologetic racist propaganda, a neo-Nazi screed arguing for the supremacy of the high IQ white race and such things as that. However, when we actually sit down and read the book, things aren't quite that simple. Consider the following quotes. If tomorrow you knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that all the cognitive differences between races were 100% genetic in origin, nothing of any significance should change. The knowledge would give you no reason to treat individuals differently than if ethnic differences were 100% environmental. In any case, you are not going to learn tomorrow that all cognitive differences between races are 100% genetic in origin, because the scientific state of knowledge, unfinished as it is, already gives ample evidence that environment is part of the story. If the reader is now convinced that either the genetic or environmental explanation has won out to the exclusion of the other, we have not done a sufficiently good job of presenting one side or the other. It seems highly likely to us that both genes and the environment have something to do with racial differences. What might the mix be? We are resolutely agnostic on that issue. As far as we can determine, the evidence does not justify an estimate. For virtually all the topics we will be discussing, cognitive ability accounts for only small to middling proportions of the variation among people. It almost always explains less than 20% of the variance, to use the statistician's term, usually less than 10% and often less than 5%. What this means in English is that you cannot predict what a given person will do from his IQ score. So what's going on here? It seems, from these quotes anyway, that the bell curve is actually a fairly reasonable piece of work. These are all relatively mild, middle-of-the-road statements here, so this hardly seems like a scabrous piece of racial pornography so far. Charles Murray has used quotes from the bell curve, such as we have just read, to defend himself and his work against accusations of racism. Murray and other defenders of the bell curve cast the attacks on the book as resulting from a cowardly reluctance to discuss what they see as difficult scientific truths. In particular, a reluctance to discuss possible differences in intelligence across designated racial groups. So this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to take a look at some of the arguments in the bell curve, discuss some of the most common counter-arguments, and see if we can figure out what all the fuss is about. Did the bell curve deserve its harsh criticism, or is it the case that its critics simply cannot handle the truth? Before we get to all that though, as you can see, this video is rather long. I expect people may have to watch this one in multiple parts, so firstly here, let's just take a second to lay out the format of the video today. First off, we're going to briefly talk about intelligence and intelligence testing, and quickly mention a few concepts that are going to be important going forward, such as Spearman's G and factor analysis. Then we're going to introduce the bell curve and summarise the arguments of each of its 4 main sections as fairly as we can. After that, we'll move on to counter-arguments in sections primarily concerned with the concept of a general intelligence, the possible problems with IQ testing, the bell curve's calculation of IQ versus environmental factors, and finally the political arguments and policy proposals found within the book. I will include time codes to all of these sections below so you can drop out and come back as needed. Right then, let's get started. And if we're going to be reading a book that is about intelligence, we should start off by briefly talking about exactly what that is. Let's imagine that we want to design an intelligence test from scratch. And to do this, we first have to answer 2 difficult questions. The first is, how exactly do we define intelligence? And this is a particularly tricky thing to do, as we'll see. Let's start with the dictionary definition of intelligence, which is as good a place to start as any, I suppose. And this is from the Oxford English Dictionary. Intelligence is the ability to acquire and apply knowledge and skills. Now, our first problem here is that this definition is rather broad. Think about all the activities and groups of activities that could fall under this definition of intelligence. Is one's ability to solve complicated mathematical sums governed by intelligence? How about the ability to solve a difficult chess puzzle? I'd imagine we'd say those things are associated with intelligence, right? Well, how about the ability to write a great novel or compose a great piece of music? Are those things influenced by intelligence, or would we merely call that creativity? Is knowing whether to pass or shoot in a game of basketball or football influenced by intelligence, or would we merely call that talent? Or are all of these things some mix of intelligence, talent, and creativity? We can certainly imagine a novel that is written intelligently, for instance. Could we say this is some sort of creative intelligence, or are intelligence and creativity strictly 2 entirely different concepts? Is there a difference between memorizing and applying a mathematical function, say, and memorizing and carrying out a piano piece, or a dance routine, or a set of football plays? If there is a difference, what is it? By what metric are we declaring some of those things to be governed by intelligence and others not? Are there such things as social and emotional intelligence? What we might call the ability to read a room, to be aware of the emotions of others, and to react appropriately in interactions with them. Is intelligence involved there, or should we just call that something like being sociable? All the various things I just mentioned can be argued to fall under the umbrella of acquiring and applying knowledge and skills, right? Defining exactly what intelligence is a very difficult thing to do, and there is a wide range of opinions among scientists and academics about the best way to go about it. Following the publication of the bell curve and inspired by the harsh criticism it received, a public statement entitled Mainstream Science on Intelligence was written by Professor Linda Gottfredson and published in the Wall Street Journal. The statement sets out to outline conclusions regarded as mainstream among researchers on intelligence, in particular on the nature, origins, and practical consequences of individual and group differences in intelligence. The statement was sent to 131 researchers, of whom 52 signed it, many of whom are themselves cited in the bell curve. Important for us here is that mainstream science on intelligence gives the following definition of intelligence. Intelligence is a very general mental capability that, among other things, involves the ability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. It is not merely book learning, a narrow academic skill, or test-taking smarts. Rather, it reflects a broader and deeper capability for comprehending our surroundings, catching on, making sense of things, or figuring out what to do. My favourite part of this definition is among other things, because intelligence is apparently all of this and some other stuff too. My point here is that even among researchers who are cited in the bell curve and would put their name to a defence of its ideas, intelligence is a very broadly defined concept. And even if we can agree on a definition of intelligence, the second difficult question we have to answer is this: how exactly do we measure it? It's not as simple as testing for some other human abilities. We can measure how fast someone is by using units of time and distance, and we can measure how strong someone is by using units of weight. But what do you use to quantify how smart someone is? What we need here is an intelligence unit. we need a way to express someone's intelligence as a number. Now, most people today will recognize IQ as the most common intelligence unit, and let's briefly talk a little about how that came to be. So way back in the old days, if we wanted to determine someone's personality traits and abilities, we could measure their skull, calculate the volume of their brain, or simply look at their facial features. Phrenology, however, has fallen out of favour with scientists of late, although it should be noted the technology sector is currently in the process of reinventing it. Now, I won't be going all that deeply into the history of intelligence testing today, so I'll just start off here by saying that researchers eventually, for the most part anyway, stopped measuring people's skulls and started trying to measure what was going on inside them. The first practical IQ test was invented by French psychologist Alfred Binet in 1905. This test set out to determine the mental age of school children and was designed with the purpose of identifying those children who were underperforming compared to their peers so they could be given extra help. Such noble beginnings here. Now, Binet, for his part, stressed that intelligence was affected by environmental factors, was not expressible as a singular fixed numerical value, and was not exclusively genetic in origin. His test was designed to identify those who were struggling in school and not to rank people into some sort of eugenic hierarchy. Binet died in 1911 and has since spent the majority of his time spinning in his grave due to everything else we're going to talk about today. An American psychologist called Henry H. Goddard translated Binet's intelligence test into English in 1908 and distributed thousands of copies of the test across the United States. And in 1916, another American psychologist named Lewis Terman, working for the Stanford Graduate School of Education, revised the test into what we know today as the Stanford-Binet IQ test. Both Goddard and Terman also worked together with other psychologists to create the Army Alpha and Army Beta tests, which were intelligence tests administered to US military recruits during World War I. Before we go any further, I'd like to pause for a second and propose a question about our intelligence tests here. How do we know that they are actually measuring intelligence? They're called intelligence tests, sure, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are actually measuring intelligence, does it? As we discussed earlier, intelligence is a very broad concept. How do we know we're not merely measuring a tiny segment of it? Well, in the early 20th century, English psychologist Charles Spearman used a statistical technique called factor analysis to identify what he called the G factor. Spearman noticed that people's test results across a range of subjects were positively correlated and reasoned that this was because of an underlying general intelligence factor, which he dubbed G. And this G factor supposedly underlies all mental performance, so no matter the subject being tested, they are all influenced by this one general intelligence factor. And psychometricians claim that IQ tests measure this G factor, psychometricians being people concerned with psychological measurement there. Now, G answers both of our difficult questions, if you've noticed. Thanks to the G factor, the vast range of potential human intelligence is no longer a barrier to us testing for it, because it's supposedly all linked to a single underlying factor that is able to be measured and expressed as a single numerical value. It's very handy, isn't it, this general intelligence factor? Suspiciously handy, one might say, but we'll talk more about G and Spearman's factor analysis later on. Now, before we conclude our little history lesson here, there is something else that must be noted, and it's that early proponents of IQ testing in America and elsewhere were not motivated solely by some neutral scientific curiosity. They were eugenicists. They wanted to use what they could learn from intelligence testing as a way to improve the genetic quality of the human population through what amounts to selective breeding. Henry Goddard, who translated Binet's intelligence test, proposed segregating the so-called feeble-minded into colonies separate from the rest of society. And Lewis Terman, author of the Stanford-Binet test, wrote the following in a 1916 work called The Uses of Intelligence Tests. Thus far, intelligence tests have found their chief application in the identification and grading of the feeble-minded. It is safe to predict that in the near future, intelligence tests will bring tens of thousands of these high-grade defectives under the surveillance of society. This will ultimately result in curtailing the reproduction of feeble-mindedness and in the elimination of an enormous amount of crime, pauperism, and industrial inefficiency. end quote. And tens of thousands of Americans were forcibly sterilized during the last century, and low IQ test results were used to justify many of those sterilizations. The eugenics movement lost a lot of momentum as a result of the Second World War, during which eugenics became irrevocably associated with many of the worst crimes of Nazi Germany. And in the following decades, many countries distanced themselves from eugenics policies, and many scientists became more suspicious of not just eugenics itself, but also the extent of the worth of intelligence testing as a concept. Now, not to spoil the end of my video here, but this is a good chunk of the reason that the reaction to the bell curve was so harsh. The idea that we can use intelligence test results in order to inform political policy was only half a lifetime before the book was written, getting people sent to gas chambers. So it's not surprising that people would be rather suspicious about it. Let's just say that anyone attempting to resurrect this idea needs to be incredibly aware of and respectful of exactly where what they're proposing can lead. So people are fleeing eugenics in droves simply because it was used to justify an indefensible crime against humanity, and scientists are increasingly skeptical of the extent of the usefulness of intelligence testing and IQ and efforts to rank people according to biology in general. And all this brings us to the bell curve. The Empire Strikes Back. And in this book, Herrnstein and Murray come to the defense of IQ and say, now, everyone calm down. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Intelligence testing and IQ are important and useful concepts, and crucially, what we can learn from IQ testing should inform our politics and be used to change our society. So, eugenics, but nice this time. And since we've now arrived at the bell curve, I think it's time for us to read it. Not all of it right now, we'd be here all day, but I will briefly summarize it here, for the most part using the introductions that precede each chapter. In the introduction to the book, Herrnstein and Murray begin by talking about intelligence. They offer Spearman's definition of intelligence as a person's capacity for complex mental work, and argue that general intelligence can be measured by IQ tests, saying, furthermore, the classicists point out, the best standardized tests, such as a modern IQ test, do a reasonably good job of measuring IQ. When properly administered, the tests are not measurably biased against socioeconomic, ethnic, or racial subgroups. They predict a wide variety of socially important outcomes. They also defend the practice of IQ testing from critics within the scientific community, notably evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould, whose 1981 book, The Mismeasure of Man, was, quoting the back of my copy here, immediately hailed as a masterwork, the ringing answer to those who would classify people, rank them according to their supposed genetic gifts and limits. In this book, Gould is highly critical of everything from phrenology and craniometry to modern IQ testing. He argues against the concept of a single general intelligence, and he highlights cases where eugenicists and psychometricians had relied upon bad data and flawed statistical techniques, including the case of Cyril Burt, an early proponent of the use of twin studies for examining the heritability of intelligence, who, after he died, was revealed to have just been making up his research data. That's one way to do it, I suppose. The bell curve was written with the mismeasure of man in mind, and is in some ways a response to its claims. A newer edition of the mismeasure of man was printed with an extra chapter responding to the claims of the bell curve, and a newer edition of the bell curve was printed with an extra chapter responding in part to Stephen Jay Gould. Gould and Murray probably should have just met up and had a fight at this point. On pages 22 and 23, Herrnstein and Murray summarize their main claims about intelligence, which are the following. 1. There is such a thing as a general factor of cognitive ability on which human beings differ. 2. All standardized tests of academic aptitude or achievement measure this general factor to some degree, but IQ tests expressly designed for that purpose measure it most accurately. 3. IQ scores match, to a first degree, whatever it is that people mean when they use the word intelligent or smart in ordinary language. 4. IQ scores are stable, although not perfectly so, over much of a person's life. 5. Properly administered IQ tests are not demonstrably biased against social, economic, ethnic, or racial groups. And 6. Cognitive ability is substantially heritable, apparently no less than 40% and no more than 80%. And on that last point, Herrnstein and Murray later write in a section titled How Much is IQ a Matter of Genes? For purposes of this discussion, we will adopt a middling estimate of 60% heritability, which by extension means that IQ is about 40% a matter of environment. So, on to part 1 of the bell curve, which is titled The Emergence of a Cognitive Elite, and introduces Herrnstein and Murray's theory of the cognitive partitioning of society. Since World War II, they argue, colleges in the United States have increasingly admitted people by test score rather than things like social standing or familial connections. Where you could once expect to attend a prestigious college if your father had gone there, for instance, increasingly you now need to have competitive test scores. This has led to high IQ people being found disproportionately in the top institutions and geographically close together. The job market is also increasingly IQ focused, as low IQ jobs are replaced by automation, and the best jobs have apparently become more selective of high IQ candidates. IQ is also apparently a very good predictor of job performance. These high IQ people, economically and geographically segregated from the rest of society, are increasingly partnering with each other, and since we're assuming IQ is largely genetic, are producing high IQ offspring. Society is thus stratifying itself into some sort of intelligence-based caste system. At the end of part 1, Herrnstein and Murray summarise their claims by saying, 1. The cognitive elite is getting richer in an era when everyone else is having to struggle to stay even. 2. The cognitive elite is increasingly segregated physically from everyone else in both the workplace and the neighbourhood. And 3. The cognitive elite is increasingly likely to intermarry. Part 2 of the bell curve is titled Cognitive Classes and Social Behaviour, and here Herrnstein and Murray make the case that intelligence is tied to behaviour and predictably determines various things such as the likelihood of being poor, a criminal, a high school dropout, unemployed, an unwed mother, welfare, and so on. In order to argue this, Herrnstein and Murray first introduced the source of their data, which is the Armed Forces Qualifying Test, or AFQT. This test was taken as part of the 1979 National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. The subjects of this survey were aged 14 to 22 and were administered the Armed Forces Qualifying Test in 1980. Researchers then interviewed the group over the following decade, asking them various questions about themselves. Herrnstein and Murray used the respondents' scores on the AFQT to determine the IQ of each person, and then used their later interview answers to calculate to what degree a high IQ is correlated with positive life outcomes, and to what degree a low IQ is correlated with negative outcomes. Throughout the rest of this section of the bell curve, Herrnstein and Murray go further than simply arguing for the correlation between low IQ and those negative life outcomes. They make the case that one's AFQT score correlates with them more strongly than socioeconomic status does. Herrnstein and Murray compare the AFQT scores of each respondent against their calculation of the socioeconomic status of the respondent's parents. So, as the book Inequality by Design puts it, roughly in the bell curve statistical comparisons, the parents' class represents nurture and the AFQT score represents nature. Looking at various negative life outcomes like being in poverty, being in jail, being unemployed, and so on, Herrnstein and Murray repeatedly find that for the young respondents to the survey, AFQT score, and by proxy IQ score, is a more accurate predictor of life outcomes than a parent's socioeconomic status. Herrnstein and Murray conclude this section by stating that a smarter population is more likely to be and more capable of being made into a civil citizen. Part 3 of the bell curve is titled The National Context, and is where things start getting especially controversial. This is the section of the book where they discuss differences in cognitive ability across designated racial groups. They review published literature on differences in racial IQ scores and find substantial differences between the various groups. They discuss the ways in which tests can be biased, culturally and otherwise, but ultimately conclude that these group differences cannot be explained away by bias. In Chapter 15, Herrnstein and Murray talk about how they think cognitive ability in the West is declining, stating, "Throughout the West, modernization has brought falling birth rates. The rates fall faster for educated women than the uneducated. Because education is so closely linked with cognitive ability, this tends to produce a dysgenic effect, or a downward shift in the ability distribution. Furthermore, education leads women to have their babies later, which alone also produces additional dysgenic pressure. Have you ever seen the movie Idiocracy? Because this is just that, basically. Lower IQ people have more children than higher IQ people, so therefore average IQ scores are going down. However, Herrnstein and Murray run into a problem here, which is that IQ scores had been going up, not down, in the decades prior to the publication of the bell curve. This is known as the Flynn Effect, named for intelligence researcher James R. Flynn, who documented it, and we will talk more about the bell curve's attempt to account for the Flynn Effect later on. Part 4 of the bell curve is titled Living Together and is concerned with social policy. This is where Herrnstein and Murray start proposing political solutions to the various problems they outlined in the previous chapters. They discuss and ultimately brand as ineffective all contemporary attempts to help disadvantaged children succeed in life. Things like better nutrition, better schooling, a better home environment, all these things can possibly temporarily make people smarter to a degree, but in the end, Herrnstein and Murray conclude that they will all eventually run into a genetic limit that cannot be worked around. Far more money is spent in ineffective attempts to help the disadvantaged than is spent on the gifted, Herrnstein and Murray contend, and we should thus directly shift the resources upwards to support our best and brightest. And this quote is from the introduction to Chapter 18. Some federal funds, now so exclusively focused on the disadvantaged, should be reallocated to programs for the gifted. Affirmative action in schools, as it stands, should be scrapped, of course. Herrnstein and Murray argue for a sort of race-blind, score-based affirmative action. They still support colleges accepting applicants from disadvantaged backgrounds, but only if they have comparable test scores to the other applicants. Affirmative action in the job market should also be scrapped, with Herrnstein and Murray arguing that in pursuit of equality, we have actually already overshot it, and that black people actually attain better quality jobs than white people once you account for their IQs, of course. Herrnstein and Murray argue for encouraging low IQ parents to have fewer children in a couple of different ways. Firstly, they argue for making marriage a prerequisite for parental rights. And they also support cutting off welfare for low-income mothers, stating that we urge generally that these policies, represented by the extensive network of cash and services for low-income women who have babies, be ended. They also argue more generally in favour of individualism, concluding Chapter 21 by writing, "Individualism is not only America's heritage, it must be its future." Herrnstein and Murray conclude this part of the bell curve with the following. Inequality of endowments, including intelligence, is a reality. Trying to pretend that inequality does not really exist has led to disaster. Trying to eradicate inequality with artificially manufactured outcomes has led to disaster. It is time for America to once again try living with inequality as life is lived, understanding that each human being has strengths and weaknesses, and so on. This is the end of the main text of the bell curve. Then follows 7 appendices explaining various things about the data and statistical methods used in the book, among other things. Additionally, newer versions of the bell curve contain an afterword written in response to various criticisms directed at the book by various scientists and journalists, and we will be quoting from that at several points later on. So then, that was the bell curve. And before we carry on here, I think it would be worthwhile to attempt to summarize the general argument of the book. So here is my understanding of it in 4 points. 1. General intelligence, or G, exists. General intelligence is to some degree heritable, innate, unable to be significantly changed, and unevenly distributed both within and across population groups. 2. IQ tests measure G fairly and accurately. 3. One's IQ is more important than one's social background in determining one's life outcomes. And 4. Given what we can learn from these points, we should implement conservative social policies such as limiting welfare, incentivizing marriage, abandoning affirmative action, and more broadly, we should promote a return to a more individualistic society. Now, I'm sure someone could disagree with the conservative adjective in this last point and argue that Herrnstein and Murray merely promote whatever policies seem to best address the problems they discuss. They propose better access to birth control, for instance, which is not typically a conservative policy. Overall, though, their policy recommendations definitely lean heavily to the right. So it's now time to begin looking at the counter-arguments, and we will begin with point 1 on this list and talk about general intelligence. So, if we want to understand general intelligence, we first need to understand the statistical technique by which it is calculated, factor analysis. And if we want to understand factor analysis, we first need to talk about correlation and causation. Starting with correlation then, correlation is basically statistical association. Stephen Jay Gould in The Mismeasure of Man describes it in the following way. Correlation assesses the tendency of one measure to vary in concert with another. As a child grows, for example, both its arms and legs get longer. This joint tendency to change in the same direction is called a positive correlation. Not all parts of the body display such positive correlation during growth. Teeth, for example, do not grow after they erupt. The relationship between first incisor length and leg length from, say, age 10 to adulthood would represent zero correlation. Legs would get longer while teeth changed not at all. Other correlations can be negative. One measure increases while the other decreases. We begin to lose neurons at a distressingly early age and they are not replaced. Thus, the relationship between leg length and number of neurons after mid-childhood represents negative correlation. Leg length increases while number of neurons decreases. And Gould also includes this handy illustration of some example correlation graphs here. Now, of course, leg length and arm length are positively correlated because they share an underlying cause, which is simply general biological growth. However, we can think of plenty of things that are positively correlated and do not share a cause. You might be familiar with the following examples from the page Spurious Correlations, which I will link below. Per capita cheese consumption correlates with number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets. Number of letters in winning word of Scripps National Spelling Bee correlates with number of people killed by venomous spiders, and so on. Obviously, these things have nothing to do with each other. Probably. So some correlations are just chance. It would be an error to assume a shared cause there. Correlation does not imply causation, is the saying. Now, in addition to assuming a shared cause when there is not one, another common mistake here is to ignore a shared cause when there is one. For example, when considering arm and leg length, to ignore the underlying biological growth and assume that legs are getting longer because arms are, or vice versa. There are lots of different ways to misrepresent correlations, basically. I agree with Gould when he writes the invalid assumption that correlation implies cause is probably among the 2 or 3 most serious and common errors of human reasoning. Anyway, one result of us calculating the correlation between arm and leg lengths is that we have simplified the data somewhat. The strong correlation between the two variables means we can basically express them as one, so long as we don't mind losing a little information along the way. But what if instead of just 2 variables, we wanted to compare correlations between the size of, say, 50 different body parts? Plotting 2 measurements in a graph is fairly easy. With the addition of a 3rd measurement, though, things start getting a little trickier. This figure from The Mismeasure of Man, where Gould introduces head measurements into the mix, needs another dimension in order to convey the information. And with more variables added in, the data quickly gets too complex to display with a mere 3 dimensions. And this brings us to factor analysis. Similar to how we simplified arm and leg length to a single dimension, factor analysis can be used to reduce a complex system of correlated variables to a smaller number of underlying factors. And you might find that just a few underlying factors explain the vast majority of the variations in a larger number of variables. And furthermore, you could identify which factor explained the majority of the variation. I won't be going into the exact specifics of how factor analysis works. I couldn't if I wanted to be honest, but this is basically how it is used. To quote Gould again, factor analysis is a mathematical technique for reducing a complex system of correlations into fewer dimensions. So you might be wondering, what does all this have to do with intelligence? Well, factor analysis is how psychologist Charles Spearman came up with the concept of the G factor. Spearman looked at a big mass of data showing that people's scores on various intelligence tests were positively correlated, carried out a little factor analysis, and identified the most important underlying statistical factor. He then called this G, or general intelligence. So this G is the underlying general mental ability that we are supposedly measuring with IQ tests. However, there are a few problems with this G factor. One is, as the bell curve itself points out, that it's based on statistical analysis rather than direct observation. We are inferring its existence from the data rather than measuring it directly, basically. It is the result of a particular statistical method. Secondly, simplifying the majority of the data down to a single factor can actually obscure a lot of useful information. What if the data shows that people who do well on tests of numerical ability tend to do well on other tests of numerical ability, and people who do well on tests of their language ability tend to do better on other tests of language ability? We can imagine two people who are determined to be statistically as smart as each other, but who excel in completely different areas, right? And there are several different intelligence theories identifying different clusters of mental abilities: verbal, logical, spatial, mathematical, whatever else. You can go and read about all of those if you're very bored. But what can we take away from our little chat about correlation and factor analysis here? Well, first of all, factor analysis tells us nothing about causation. It deals with correlations. It can show that there might be common factors underlying different variables, but it does not identify for us why those variables vary. As a comparison here, let's say you take a sample of 10,000 random members of the public and you test their athletic performance at various physical tests. Amount of weight lifted, length jumped, speed at running various distances, sit-ups completed, whatever. And let's say that what you find is that people who perform well on one test relative to the group tend to perform well on the other tests relative to the group, and vice versa for those who perform poorly. Now you could, if you so fancied, subject this data to factor analysis. Identify numerically the most important underlying factor and name it F for general fitness or something. And you could probably further assign each person an FQ or fitness quotient. However, what you would not have done is explain why some people are fitter than others. You would have said nothing about the heritability of athletic performance, the degree to which genetics and environment contribute to athletic performance. You'd have said nothing about the causes of the data at all. It would be a leap of logic to assume that each person's FQ is innate and unchangeable. The data you have cannot tell you any such thing by itself. You may also find that your singular numerical fitness quotient obscures a lot of useful information. For instance, you might find people who are better at strength exercises tend to be better at other strength exercises, and so on. So the mere existence of a general factor of cognitive ability would not explain why there are differences between people. In fact, the G factor is perfectly consistent with a 100% environmental approach to understanding intelligence. We could play devil's advocate here and say yes, a general factor of intelligence exists and is important, but the variance in G between people is explained entirely by environmental factors: childhood nutrition, socioeconomic status, school quality, and so on. Absolutely nothing happens in the factor analysis process to tell us about what the causes are for people having different measurable levels of intelligence. And even if we accept a single general intelligence factor exists, that would not necessarily imply a genetic causation. And speaking of genetics, let's next talk about the word heritability. When the bell curve says cognitive ability is substantially heritable, apparently no less than 40% and no more than 80%, what does that mean exactly? If we average it for 60% like they do, are we therefore to assume that each person's individual IQ is 60% determined by heritable genetics and 40% by the environment? Well, no. Heritability is unfortunately one of those awkward words which has a common use understanding and a scientific understanding which differ in a few important ways. The common use understanding is something like the ability of a thing to be passed down genetically, right? You can inherit being tall or having red hair, but you can't inherit a scar or a finger lost in an accident, say. The technical academic meaning of heritability is rather different. Heritability is a numerical concept used to estimate the contribution of genetic variance to overall variance of a trait within a group. So basically, heritability estimates the degree to which the variance of a trait within a group is due to genetics. Height is thus a heritable trait. Taller parents will generally have taller offspring, for example, and this is measurable against a population group. Having 2 arms, however, is not a heritable trait, because almost everyone has 2 arms, and for people who don't have 2 arms, that variance is usually environmental in nature. Having 2 arms is genetically determined, but it is not a heritable trait, if you follow, because genes account for very little of the variance within the population group. Something that is very highly heritable, we would say, has a heritability of 1. Something that is not heritable at all, we would say, has a heritability of 0. If we say something has a heritability of 0.6, then what we mean there is that 60% of the variance of the trait in a population group will be due to genetic factors. What it does not mean is that 60% of the trait in one individual is due to their genes and 40% due to the environment. Heritability tells us about variance within a group, not the makeup of individuals. It is a population statistic. You cannot meaningfully ask what the heritability of your IQ is. So where am I going with this? Well, there's a couple of points that I'd like to make. The first is that a trait can be determined by your genes and be very lowly heritable, such as the presence of arms, and also the inverse of that. A trait could be very highly heritable and not directly genetically determined. One common example used to illustrate this is earrings. What would we say accounts for the variance in whether people wear earrings within a particular group? Well, depending on the group, most of the variance could be due, in one sense, to a genetic factor, biological sex. Wearing earrings would therefore be a heritable trait, but this does not mean that there is an earring gene that is being passed down generationally. The majority of people wearing earrings being women would be due to environmental factors, fashion and gender roles, which are subject to change over time. In more recent years, for example, men in the West have increasingly been wearing earrings. The heritability of the trait of wearing earrings is thus decreasing, because less of the variance is being accounted for by genetics. But crucially here, nothing is actually happening genetically on the earring front. The change in heritability is down to changing environmental factors. When we say something is due to genetics, we need to be very careful about exactly what we mean. A useful categorization here is direct versus indirect genetic determination. We need to be sure to differentiate between things that are directly genetically determined, as in your genes are directly causing some biochemical process to happen within you, and things that are indirectly genetically determined as a result of your genes interacting with your environment. Women being more likely to wear earrings, for instance, is a heritable trait, but it is not directly genetically determined. This is relevant to us because IQ could be such a trait, where differences in IQ across designated racial groups are caused not by a direct genetic process, but instead by how our genetically determined characteristics interact with our environment so as to affect our results on IQ tests. For example, let's imagine your genes cause you to have a particular skin color, and you live in a segregated society in which people with that skin color are discriminated against and do not have equal access to education. Now, that group's lower results on IQ tests would be, in one sense, because of their genes. And scientists studying genetics might very well find a strong correlation between particular genes and lowered IQ test results. But if we don't take the environment into account, that by itself can't tell us anything. The point here is that a trait could be very highly heritable and correlated strongly with particular genes and still have zero direct genetic determination. Now, the idea that wearing earrings can be more of a heritable trait than having ears is admittedly a bit of a difficult concept to grasp at first sight, and I would understand if it took a little time for someone to wrap their head around all this. Right now, though, what I want you to take away from this section, if nothing else, is the idea that something being heritable does not necessarily mean it is actually being directly caused by genetics. My next point is that heritability estimates the causes of variance within a group. It cannot tell us about reasons for differences across groups. And to illustrate this, we will paraphrase a thought experiment by geneticist Richard Lewontin. Let's say we take a packet of seeds and plant them in fertilized soil in a controlled laboratory environment, and we ensure that the growing plants have sufficient and equal amounts of water and light. And doesn't that sound nice? Now, height in plants is a heritable trait, just like in humans, and the plants would thus grow to a range of different heights. Height in this experiment would be very highly heritable, because the fact we're ensuring the plants have an equal environment means that the variance in heights in the group is solely down to genetics. Next, let's say we do that experiment again, only this time we plant the seeds in bad soil and give them less, but equal within the group, amounts of water and light. The thing to understand here is that height in this second experiment would be exactly as heritable as in the previous experiment. All of the plants from the second group have the same group environment, meaning that again, the group variance in heights would be solely down to genetics. The poor environment will produce smaller plants, but since they are all subject to that environment equally, heritability remains high. The problems arise when we start trying to compare these two groups. Let's say the second group of plants has an average height that is 15% shorter than the first group, for instance. The heritability of height tells us nothing about why that is. Heritability was the same across both groups. If you're trying to figure out why one group of plants grew larger than the other, saying height is heritable tells us nothing useful. The difference between the groups was entirely down to environmental factors, and heritability, despite being high, played no part. The 2 points we can take from this thought experiment are, firstly, the heritability of traits does not account for group differences, and secondly, a trait having a high heritability does not mean that trait is immutable or unaffected by the environment. For another example of this, height in humans is a highly heritable trait, but the average human height increased substantially over the last century, and this was due to environmental changes such as better healthcare and nutrition. Or for another example, North Koreans are on average a few inches shorter than South Koreans, and this is down to the different material conditions in those two countries, not some recent radical divergence in genetics. Height is heritable in both North and South Korea, but it's the environment that is the cause of the variance between the groups. This is something that the bell curve crucially misunderstands when talking about the heritability of intelligence and IQ. On page 109 they say, even a heritability of 0.6 leaves room for considerable change if the changes in environment are commensurably large. The implication here being that higher heritabilities would be less affected by changes in the environment, and this is just not how it works. IQ could be 100% heritable and still massively affected by changes in the group environment. Professor Ned Block from New York University makes several of these points about heritability in an article entitled How Heritability Misleads About Race, and then goes on to say, I hope these points remove the temptation exhibited in the bell curve to think of the heritability of IQ as a constant like the speed of light. Heritability is a population statistic just like birth rate or number of TVs and can be expected to change with changing circumstances. These issues are pathetically misunderstood by Charles Murray. In a CNN interview reported in the New Republic, Murray declared, when we say 60% heritability, it's not 60% of the variation, it is 60% of the IQ in any given person. Later, he repeated that for the average person, 60% of the intelligence comes from heredity, and added that this was true of the human species, missing the point that heritability makes no sense for an individual and that heritability statistics are population relative. So if you don't quite understand all this stuff about heritability, don't feel too bad, because Charles Murray doesn't understand it either. Or at least he didn't 25 years ago. He may have done his homework since then, who knows. Looking again at the bell curve's list of claims about intelligence, the only one on here that could be said to be making a point about genetics is number 6. Cognitive ability is substantially heritable. However, as we've seen, a trait being heritable does not necessarily mean a direct genetic cause. It does not tell us anything about the heritability of a particular individual's intelligence, and it cannot tell us the reason for differences between groups of people. Those differences between people could be caused by environmental factors because, twist. Environments are heritable too. As the bell curve itself points out, non-genetic characteristics can nonetheless run in families. For practical purposes, environments are heritable too. So to summarize this section, we have considered the method by which a general intelligence factor is determined, and also claims about its heritability. But we can conclude from neither of these things that the variance in intelligence between groups of people has a direct genetic cause. The cause could simply be directly due to the environment, or indirectly by way of how genes are interacting with that environment. So why am I listing off all the ways in which Herrnstein and Murray do not prove a genetic cause for cognitive ability, you might ask? Their later comparisons of IQ and environmental factors assume that IQ is largely genetic in origin, so presumably they do prove it at some point, right? Well, to put it bluntly, no. In their section, How Much is IQ a Matter of Genes?, they estimate the heritability of IQ scores by talking about twin studies. We can use studies of identical twins, non-identical twins, and regular siblings to estimate the extent of genetic effects on IQ by noting the differences in correlations between their scores on intelligence tests. However, there are a few problems with this. Most importantly for us here being that in attempting to learn about genetic cognitive ability via intelligence test scores, we have to make the assumption that intelligence tests are an accurate measure of cognitive ability, but more on that in a moment. Even if we assume that the tests do give an accurate representation of cognitive ability, attempts to use these correlations to construct a simple genetic model for IQ run into several issues. Firstly, the IQs of identical twins do not perfectly correlate, as we would expect them to, given their nearly identical genetics. The correlation of siblings who are raised apart is weaker than the correlation of siblings who are raised together, and probably most troublesome for a purely genetic model here is that there is also some correlation between parents and adopted children. Their scores correlate to some degree, despite there being no immediate genetic link, beyond being the same species, of course. So in our search for exactly how much genetics affects cognitive ability, these observations are only ever going to get us so far. It's very difficult to disentangle the genetic effects from the environmental ones. What we really need here is genetics research to advance to the point where we understand exactly which genes influence intelligence and to which degree they influence intelligence. When the bell curve was published, the evidence was not there. As Herrnstein and Murray admit, the state of knowledge does not permit a precise estimate. And in 2019, 25 years later, the evidence is still not there. If anything, with regards to the claims in the bell curve, particularly its claims about racial differences, the genetic story has only gotten more complicated. The reason I say designated racial groups instead of racial groups during this video is because on a genetic level, our skin color folk understanding of racial groups can be unhelpful. There can be greater genetic differences within our socially constructed racial groups than between them. I doubt anyone would be so naive as to expect us to one day identify the singular gene that controls both skin color and intelligence. Someone having dark skin and thus being identified and identifying as black could have a whole range of genetic history. You can't read someone's genes by looking at their skin color. This is important for us because the authors of the bell curve use our socially constructed racial groups in their book. Talking about this, they say, what does it mean to be black in America in racial terms when the word black or African American can be used for people whose ancestry is more European than African? How are we to classify a person whose parents hail from Panama but whose ancestry is predominantly African? Is he A Latino, A black? The rule we follow here is to classify people according to the way they classify themselves. It would be a leap of logic to assume genetic explanations for characteristics of self-identified groups, given that those groups could have a wide range of genetic makeups. My point with all this is that the bell curve's direct evidence of a genetic basis for IQ is missing. Charles Murray's attitude towards this problem in the years since the publication of the book has been to kick the can down the road, assuming that he and Herrnstein were prematurely right, to borrow a phrase from his afterword to the bell curve, and that the accumulating genetic evidence will prove him right if everyone just waits a little longer. and it remains his tactic more than 2 decades later. In October of this year, Professor Ewan Birney, the director of the European Bioinformatics Institute, published a blog post titled Race, Genetics and Pseudoscience, an Explainer, which discusses, among other things, how our traditional racial categorizations are not reflected in actual patterns of genetic variation, how distinct groups within Africa can be as distinct from each other as they are with non-Africans, how race is not a useful or accurate term for geneticists, and it says that it is often suggested that geneticists who emphasize the biological invalidity of race are under the thumb of political correctness, forced to suppress their real opinions in order to maintain their positions in the academy. Such accusations are unfounded and betray a lack of understanding of what motivates science. Charles Murray responded to this post on Twitter a few days later, saying, "I can't understand why people are so eager to go public with positions for which the weight of the accumulating evidence is so unwelcome and that will be definitively settled within a few years." So it seems the evidence for Murray is still just a few years away. With regards to the bell curve, however, it is possible we are being a little unfair when we criticise it for basing much of its analysis on relatively crude estimations. After all, they do admit the evidence is not there, and they say, if the reader is now convinced that either the genetic or environmental explanation has won out to the exclusion of the other, we have not done a sufficiently good job of presenting one side or the other. We should not criticise scientists for saying the evidence isn't there yet, but here's a rough guess. Presenting such estimates and attempting to disprove them is a key part of the scientific process. Problems arise when we get to part 4 of the bell curve, however. While it is fine to say the evidence isn't there yet, but here's a rough guess, it is not so fine to say the evidence isn't there yet, here's a rough guess, and based upon this rough guess, you should immediately suspend welfare programs for underprivileged children. But we'll talk more about this later when we discuss the politics of the bell curve. For now, though, let's address the assumption I mentioned earlier when talking about twin studies. We have been, in this section, assuming that we can measure native intelligence accurately. If we cannot measure native intelligence accurately, then much of what we've talked about thus far is irrelevant. So it's now time to talk about IQ tests. So I summarised the bell curve's claims about IQ tests as IQ tests measure G fairly and accurately. I wrote fairly because of their statement properly administered IQ tests are not demonstrably biased against social, economic, ethnic or racial groups, and I wrote the word accurately because of their statement that all standardised tests of academic aptitude or achievement measure this general factor to some degree, but IQ tests expressly designed for that purpose measure it most accurately. So firstly here, we're going to discuss a few of the possible problems with IQ tests, starting with the various ways in which they can deliver biased results. Now, direct cultural bias in IQ test items is discussed by Herrnstein and Murray in Chapter 13. They use an example of a question that includes the word regata, which is a word that might bias the results towards certain cultural and economic groups. And certain historical so-called intelligence test questions have actually been much worse than this. Some of them amounted to nothing more than general knowledge questions. The Army Alpha test used in World War I asked Army recruits to identify what particular celebrities were famous for, in which cities certain cars were manufactured, and the products produced by certain brands. Questions like these obviously have very little to do with any native intellectual ability, they're just testing whether or not you happen to already know the answer. There's no opportunity to work it out, so any psychometricians constructing intelligence tests certainly need to be careful to not include biased test items like these ones. Tests can also be biased for instruction. And what do we mean by instruction here? Well, simply whether or not you've been taught the meaning of a word or the best method for solving a maths problem is going to matter a lot on a test that requires you to draw upon your mathematical and language abilities. As an example here, I'm going to assume that we all agree it would be unfair to expect a random teenager to, by themselves, during a test, invent trigonometry. If you include trigonometry questions on your intelligence test, what you'll be testing for there will not solely be the intelligence of the respondent, but also whether or not they've been taught trigonometry before, how recently they were taught it, and how well they were taught it. This is relevant for us here because the Armed Forces Qualifying Test, which is the primary source of intelligence test data in the bell curve, had as one of its 4 sections a mathematics test which included questions examining knowledge of classroom trigonometry and algebra. This is more of a test of scholastic aptitude than native intelligence, and is also testing by proxy the quality of the teaching at the different schools that the AFQT respondents went to. We can't assume that to be equal across thousands of different people, can we? This is one of a few problems with the AFQT that has roots in the fact that it was not designed as an IQ test, but more on that in a second. Another way that IQ tests can be biased is for speed. Think of the definitions of intelligence we've seen so far: a capacity for complex mental work, catching on, making sense of things, and figuring out what to do. And simply because of the way IQ tests are administered, we have to add the words "within the time constraints of an academic test" to all of those things. IQ tests are by their nature biased towards how fast you can think and away from other important qualities which contribute to overall cognitive ability, such as stamina, determination, and discipline. Similar to that point, IQ tests have a more general bias towards familiarity with an academic environment. People unfamiliar with taking tests are going to fare worse than people who are very used to it, simply due to being in an unfamiliar environment. Things like anxiety and stress come into play here. Those can affect intelligence test results despite having nothing directly to do with intelligence themselves. Herrnstein and Murray are particularly aware of that last point, and we need to briefly discuss the Flynn effect here. So when IQ tests are constructed, they're standardized using a sample of test takers. Now what that means in practice is the testers will test some people, work out the average score, and set that to correspond to 100. This is why we recognize an IQ of 100 as the average. When those IQ tests are later revised, or when new IQ tests are designed, they're also standardized on new groups of people, and their average is set again to 100. However, researchers noticed that when newer test subjects take the older versions of a test, their IQ scores are on average higher. So IQ scores have gone up over time, basically, meaning if you believe that IQ tests measure intelligence, then people must be getting more intelligent, right? This is troublesome for Herrnstein and Murray because they argue the opposite, that cognitive ability is deteriorating. And this brings us back to our point about bias towards an academic environment. Addressing the Flynn effect, Herrnstein and Murray write the following. There is a further question to answer. Does a 15-point IQ difference between grandparents and their grandchildren mean that the grandchildren are 15 points smarter? Some experts do not believe that the rise is wholly, perhaps not even partly, a rise in intelligence, but in the narrower skills involved in intelligence test-taking per se. So this, if it were true, would mean that people are actually getting less intelligent, but at the same time, they are getting better at taking IQ tests. Now, you might say, isn't that a huge contradiction? Aren't they basically admitting that IQ tests measure something other than inborn intelligence? After all, if IQ tests supposedly measure native cognitive ability accurately, how could scores be going up while cognitive ability is going down? However, to be fair to Herrnstein and Murray, it would be hasty to dismiss their dysgenics hypothesis outright. There is another possibility here, and it's that people are getting genetically less intelligent, but the environmental factors affecting intelligence have undergone such large changes that their positive effects upon IQ are more than accounting for the downward genetic ability shift. So roughly we would have lost a genetic IQ point thanks to dysgenics, but gained 2 back thanks to a better environment. So what evidence does the bell curve produce in support of this downward trend in genetic cognitive ability? Well, unfortunately for Herrnstein and Murray, their main source of data, the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, is not much use here. Ideally, what we want to do is give IQ tests to the children of women who took part in the AFQT, so we could directly compare child to parent and see if any downwards shift was happening. However, this would be a mistake, as since our data is coming from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, the respondents are, appropriately, young. People who wait longer to have children are typically wealthier and better educated, and thus tend to have children with higher IQs. Limiting ourselves to looking at only young mothers will skew the apparent IQ of the next generation downwards, so it would be an inaccurate thing to do. Herrnstein and Murray are thankfully well aware of this problem, not that it stops them from trying, however. Herrnstein and Murray's dysgenics hypothesis is discussed in Intelligence, Genes and Success. Scientists Respond to the Bell Curve, a 1997 book which responds to many of the points made in the bell curve. The authors of that book, for their part, find no direct empirical evidence either for or against a dysgenic effect acting upon cognitive ability, stating that insofar as we are aware, there is nothing but anecdotal evidence for dysgenics. Anyway, let's get back on track. Now, to illustrate another way IQ tests can be biased, I think it would be a good exercise for us all to briefly take a very simple one-question test together. So get your pencil and paper ready, folks. Here it is. Easy, right? An incredibly simple number sequence question there, the sort you'd expect nearly anyone to be able to work out. It's also a fair and unbiased question, of course. I mean, everyone was given the exact same question and the exact same amount of time to answer it, right? What could be more fair and unbiased than that? Now, of course, this question is not fair. It is biased, in favor of Japanese people. And anime fans, I guess. The point here is that this question would, in any language, be biased against people who don't speak that language. A question in English is biased against people who don't speak English, isn't it? Now you might protest. This seems like a very obvious point. I mean, surely nobody is going to give an IQ test in English to a group of people who are not fluent in English and then try to pass off those results as legitimate, right? Well, stay tuned, folks. One point not given due consideration by the bell curve during their discussion of testing bias is that even a completely unbiased test, were it possible to construct such a thing, would still deliver biased results if it were being carried out in a biased system. When Herrnstein and Murray say properly administered IQ tests are not demonstrably biased, they seemingly mean that the tests themselves do not contain words like regatta, not that the tests necessarily deliver fair results. So that is another potential problem with IQ tests to watch out for. Even if we eliminate as much cultural bias as possible from the test, we could still, thanks to the wider environment the tests are taking place in, be receiving biased results. For instance, if you carried out an IQ test in a racially segregated white supremacist state, that environment is obviously going to affect the average IQ scores of different designated racial groups. Now you might protest. This also seems like a very obvious point. I mean, surely nobody's going to carry out an IQ test in a racially segregated white supremacist state and then try to pass off those results as legitimate, right? Again, stay tuned, folks. Now, keeping in mind all the various possible problems with IQ testing that we've just discussed, let's take a look at a few of the IQ tests that Herrnstein and Murray cite as evidence for claims in the bell curve. Surely they will be properly administered, right? After all, Herrnstein and Murray themselves discuss many of the same issues that we just have. It would follow that given their familiarity with these potential problems, they would of course endeavour to avoid them. So let's see how they do on that front. We'll take a look at a particular section of the bell curve now, see what the claims are, and then have a bit of a dig into the sources backing up those claims. And this is from a section titled, How Do African Americans Compare with Blacks in Africa on Cognitive Tests? And I quote, This question often arises in the context of black-white comparisons in America, the thought being that the African black population has not been subjected to the historical legacy of American black slavery and discrimination, and might therefore have higher scores. Richard Lynn was able to assemble 11 studies in his 1991 review of the literature. He estimated the median black African IQ to be 75, approximately 1.7 standard deviations below the US overall population average, about 10 points lower than the current figure for American blacks. In summary, African blacks are, on average, substantially below African Americans in intelligence test scores. Psychometrically, there is little reason to think that these results mean anything different about cognitive functioning than they mean in non-African populations. For our purposes, the main point is that the hypothesis about the special circumstances of American blacks depressing their test scores is not substantiated by the African data. So this is Herrnstein and Murray's answer to those who point to the legacy of slavery and discrimination in the United States as an explanation for the differences in IQ scores between its black and white populations. They point to black people in Africa and say, hey, well, they also got lower scores. Black African people haven't been subject to discrimination in America, after all, so doesn't this prove that discrimination in America can't be depressing black IQ scores? Well, not really. Herrnstein and Murray's decision to limit their concern here to American black slavery and discrimination is a huge oversight, because there could also be discrimination in whichever parts of Africa they are talking about, if you follow. That could be, in a similar way, depressing the scores there too. If that were the case, attempting to use the African data as some sort of control test for the American data would be fairly ridiculous, to say the least. America does not have a monopoly on discrimination and depression, does it? And so we need to ask, which parts of Africa are they talking about? They say that Richard Lynn was able to assemble 11 studies in his 1991 review of the literature. Now, Herrnstein and Murray claim in the acknowledgements at the start of the bell curve to have benefited especially from the advice of this Richard Lynn, who they elsewhere call a leading scholar of racial and ethnic differences, and they cite his work several times throughout the book. So let's take a look at Richard Lynn's 1991 review of the literature, entitled Race Differences in Intelligence, A Global Perspective, which was published in Mankind Quarterly. And remember the name of that journal, folks, as we'll be talking more about that later on. So the first thing we'll notice about this review is that it unfortunately designates people as either Caucasoids, Mongoloids, or Negroids, including, quote, hybrids of those groups, for instance, Caucasoid, Negroid hybrids, and so on. I can only apologise for having to read out this rubbish. So let's look at the 11 studies included in this review and see which areas of Africa we are concerned with. Well, there's one from what was then known as the Belgian Congo, one from Ghana, 2 from Nigeria, 1 from Uganda, 1 from Zambia, and 5 from South Africa. And there is rather a lot to comment on here, but how about we start with sample sizes? Some of them are rather small, you may have noticed. 87 people for Nigeria, 50 people for Uganda, and so on. By far the most represented area here is South Africa. The number of people tested in South Africa was more than double the number of all the other subjects combined. And what's the significance of this? Well, this review was published in 1991. South African apartheid ended in 1994. Now, I don't want to get too deep into this right now, but for those who don't know, apartheid was an explicitly white supremacist system of enforced racial segregation. Non-white South Africans were openly discriminated against, forced from their homes, forbidden to live in certain areas and hold certain jobs, and most importantly for us here, had to attend segregated schools, which were massively underfunded compared to the schools that the white South Africans went to, many being without electricity or even running water. And just so we know the sort of education system we're dealing with here, I'll quickly quote some relevant passages from South Africa, a country study from the Library of Congress. The Bantu Education Act of 1953 widened the gaps in educational opportunities for different racial groups. 2 of the architects of Bantu education, Dr. W.M. Iserlen and Dr. Hendrik F. Verwoerd, had studied in Germany and adopted many elements of National Socialist, Nazi, philosophy. The concept of racial purity in particular provided a rationalization for keeping black education inferior. Verwoerd, then Minister of Native Affairs, said that black Africans should be educated for their opportunities in life, and that there was no place for them above the level of certain forms of labor. The Bantu Education Act helped pave the way for labor strife in the 1980s and 1990s by institutionalizing a plan to restrict black workers to low-paid jobs through deliberately inferior education. During the 1960s and 1970s, per capita spending on white pupils was about 10 times greater than educational spending on black pupils. By the early 1990s, the gap had been reduced by half, but in general, standards for teacher qualifications and facilities in black schools continued to be inferior to those in white schools. The discrepancies in education among racial groups were glaring. Teacher-pupil ratios in primary schools averaged 1 to 18 in white schools, 1 to 24 in Asian schools, 1 to 27 in coloured schools, and 1 to 39 in black schools. Moreover, whereas 96% of all teachers in white schools had teaching certificates, only 15% of teachers in black schools were certified. Secondary school pass rates for black pupils in the nationwide standardized high school graduation exam